Dear colleagues, please take a seat. Now we start our next session, which is actually a keynote lecture, and I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Cecilia Skingsley, the Deputy Governor of Swedish Central Bank, Riksbank. It's definitely for us an honor to have Cecilia here, I think for two reasons. One, for institutional. One, because Riksbank definitely is one of the, let's say, role models in the area of communications of monetary policy and so on. I actually have seen it myself in December last year when I was in Stockholm, the monetary policy meeting of the bank, and then I saw actually the way the bank has been communicating it and so on. So honestly, I was thinking that, you know, in a advanced economy, when things are, from our point of view, are much smoother and much less turbulent than in Ukraine, you should not get so much interest from journalists, but I was really surprised. I mean, how big was the interest, and definitely the Governor Ingves was, I would say, really grilled by the journalists all the way during the press conference. Then I came back to my hotel in the evening, turned on TV, and Mr. Ingves was all over TV in the evening. So no TV shows, no football or hockey games, only Mr. Ingves explaining why Riksbank raised the interest rate. And actually, from personal point of view, it's very good also to have Cecilia here because she has a journalist background. The thing that's a very big advantage. You know, we as central bankers now talking each other and discussing these communication challenges we are facing, and some people are very openly complaining. They say, oh, I'm academic economist, yeah, I have not been trained for communicating with the public every day. So, and I think here Cecilia has a very natural advantage, let's say, over a lot of other central bankers. So therefore, please, Cecilia, the floor is yours.
And thank you for the opportunity to be here. The Riksbank, as Dimitri says, is in close cooperation with the National Bank of Ukraine in several different areas. And given the theme of this conference, I'd like to stay in line with those who congratulate you on winning this year's Central Bank Transparency Award. I think it's well deserved. I think also we have a very topical theme for today's conference, because central bank communication moves now into the center of central bank operations. I am here replacing Governor Stefan Ingves, who was supposed to give the keynote speech. But unfortunately for him, but also for you, he's ill. He got a serious cold last week and he needs to recover from that. However, I am absolutely delighted to be here to talk about this thing, because this is a subject that is very close to my heart. And as was mentioned, I have not only been in central banking all my life, but I spent my 90s as a financial journalist, and then I've spent a number of years also in the financial markets being a central bank watcher. So I have scrutinized every step of the way that the central bank, the Riksbank, has taken when it comes to becoming more transparent. And I can tell you, being from a both outside perspective and on the inside perspective, this has been a tremendously successful story. And I'm very happy to be able to share that with you today. And I hope it will give you some inspiration as you move along in your work. To first give you a summary of my message, you can say this is in two ways, two messages. We have to expect future changes that impose demands on how we communicate. First is that we have to expect new demands on central banks, and there I'm thinking about how our remits could potentially be developed in the years to come, and I'll come back to that. And secondly, we need to think about how we communicate and ramp up our ability to communicate, because we are observing technological developments and digitalization. There are new ways of communicating, social medias, etc., and we have to address these changes in a comprehensive way. We have to be prepared to constantly change and adapt. That is, if we want to remain an important cornerstone in the well-functioning economies, which we like to do as central bankers. If we maintain strong confidence in our operations, and if we don't, we gain trust. And if we fail, I think that independence, the autonomy that has traditionally been developed in the central bank communities over the last decades, could actually be at risk. So being able to communicate is a crucial factor in building the central bank's legitimacy. So I'm going to spend the next half hour to talk about why communications has become a key factor, and also the challenges in communications as the media landscape evolves. If you talk to anthropologists and other people in other research fields who study how people behave and has behaved through history, there is one common line that most people have discovered, and that is that human beings love to listen to stories. Stories helps us understand and reflect on what has happened, what is happening, and what to expect in the future. Stories also gives us common knowledge, form values, and in ways that no other living species is capable of doing. And by sharing stories and by communicating over stories, we can build and receive trust and confidence is being created, and that in return can support solidarity. And to be honest and frank with you, central banking and what we try to achieve is also about developing and telling stories. We explain what has happened in the economy. We try to describe what is happening right now. And we do forecasts and analysis. We predict the future to the best of our ability. And then we argue for an appropriate monetary policy in line with our mandates. And we think with communication, we build legitimacy for the central bank operations. But as I said, new demands on communication is arriving, new technologies, new channels, new readers and listeners, and therefore we have to adopt to new versions of receiving our messages. And this is critical because there is a close link between our ability to communicate and our ability to maintain central bank independence. We all know that the independence has been a global trend over the last few decades because the experiences has been clear that independent central banks are finding it more easier to achieve price stability and prevent crises compared to central banks that are more regulated and more politically managed. And from the early 1990s and the advent of inflation targeting beginning in New Zealand in the early 90s, this view has remained relatively unchallenged. But over the last few years, after the global financial crisis, independence has increasingly been called into question. Some says, frankly, that there is too much powers within the central banks, there is too little accountability, and there is, sometimes people call it, a democratic deficit. And to give you a very current issue from my own country, in Sweden, there is now a review of the Sveriges Riksbank Act, the legislation that governs us. And the question of the role and the mandate of the central bank is being scrutinized, and that also include the degree of independence. We don't yet know what will be the final outcome of this. There will be a report by the end of this year, but it's then up to the legislators of the parliament to make the final decision-making. But I think the assessment of the Swedish central bank legislation and the final result of a new legislation will work as a test and reveal what level of independence that will be accepted in the central banking world in the years to come. And I think in order to protect the level of independence for the future, which we all, I think is a good thing when we try to achieve our price stability objectives, will be linked to how well the central bank managed to communicate our role and what we try to achieve and the ways we do to achieve that. Now, going back to the 90s and taking Sweden as a case, I'm going to give you a bit of a story on how we proceeded becoming a more open central bank. The inflation target was put in place in 1993, and the watchwords were already then openness and clarity. And this was very critical to build confidence in monetary policy and inflation target after the major financial crisis in the early 1990s, where the Swedish economy was in very bad shape, and the general level of trust, both in monetary policy and fiscal policy and institutions as a whole, was at a very low level. The Swedes didn't trust the system, and that was also for good reasons. So the Riksbank began with the inflation target in 1993, and then the Riksbank's independence was consolidated in 1999 as a result of the European Union membership 5 years before. And the price stability objective was confirmed by the Swedish law. An executive board, where I'm one of the 6 members, was constituted. And the aim of the legislative changes at the time was really to strengthen the Riksbank's standing and independence. And it was clear at the time that the legislators were thinking that in a more independent Riksbank was much more able to provide monetary policy with a long-term perspective and hence credibility. And then the executive boards, because there has been different compositions over the years, has been much more transparent than has been required by the law. We have been, to the best of our ability, open up about our work, our assessments, and our decisions, because we think it builds confidence in the price stability objective. So we were early, working with press releases, press conferences, minutes from the meeting, speeches and interviews. And I think the impact of our policy depends on how well we manage to communicate. We are also open, we also acknowledge the fact that if we are open about our forecasts and how we assess the forecasts and the choice between different policy tools, it also makes it possible for various stakeholders outside the central bank to evaluate us. And I'm convinced that we would not have been able to build up the confidence in the price stability objective as quickly as was done in the 90s if the central bank of that time hadn't been as open as it was regarding the work and our decisions. I was a financial journalist in the 90s, and when the central bank came out, they said, we're going to aim for 2% inflation. You could almost like hear the collective giggle across the country saying 2%, 5%, that would be the best, 2%. We haven't had 2% inflation in a long, long, long time. I don't think anyone even can recall inflation of 2%. So the Riksbank had an uphill battle at the time, but managed to get it where they wanted it pretty quickly. To give you some more examples and dates on this journey, up to October 2005, inflation forecasts were based on the assumption that the policy rate would not change during the forecast period. So inflation forecast was based on the notion that we didn't do anything with the policy rate. A very simple rule, but very difficult to evaluate and compare forecasts as a result. The central bank of the time, October 2005 and onwards, then decided to base the forecasts on market expectations instead. But this turned out to be particularly difficult with communications, because assessments by the market participants about the future interest rates could differ sharply from those that was done by the Riksbank. So the Riksbank learned from this, and 2 years later, in February 2007, we now present our own forecasts of our own policy rate development. This makes it easier to understand the motives behind our decisions. It also makes it easier for other stakeholders to evaluate the monetary policy. And we think it also creates good conditions for accountability and legitimacy. Again, crucial bits of maintaining an independent central bank. Now it's hard to believe and think about going back to a situation where you do not publish a repo rate path in the way we do it. Struggle at first, but very successful at the second, when we had got adjusted to it. There has also been other advantages coming with that. We have more discussions internally about alternative future rate paths, and the executive board members now participates in the forecasting work to much greater extent than in the past. By being open and clear outside, we have to provide better analysis, and that increases incentives for everyone to do a good job, because good analysis is a prerequisite for efficient communication. From May 2007 and onwards, we do press conferences after every monetary policy meeting So we do 6 policy meetings a year, and we have press conferences after every meeting, independent what we do with the policy, monetary policy. We also publish about 10 days after the meeting minutes showing who has made which contributions. And from May 2009 onwards, we publish immediately the voting figures and the reservations in the press release. So if Skingsley disagree with the rate hike or has any kind of obstacles against enter reservations against forecasts, everybody will know that immediately as the press release is being published. You don't do these changes as a big bang. It's a gradual process. But we think that by doing open up and try to be clear about the assessment of the future policy rate, and then it's a long process which is full of requirements and considerations. And when we look at the result, this is inflation in Sweden since the 1980s and onwards. We think it has been 25 reasonably successful years. Inflation has gone from a high and volatile development into a low and much more stable development. To be honest, there has also been a number of other excellent economic policy reforms, and especially the wage formation organizations in Sweden has done a tremendous job sorting out the wage formation process. But all in all, we think that the independence in monetary policy has definitely done its work that led to a low and stable inflation. And as you know, stable inflation is the best contribution from monetary policy to a stable and prosperous economy. So, with inflation targets, it's required to think about how to communicate with the aim to influence expectations of households and companies. Because our best friend, as you know, is to have stable inflation expectations. And just to summarize again this part of the presentation, we opened up the windows of the central bank, not all at the same time, but now we have the situation with press conferences after each rate-setting meeting, publications of our own repo rate forecasts, the names in the monetary policy minutes, allowing for markets, other stakeholders to scrutinize the assessments of every individual board member, the room for reservations in the press releases, and we also make an emphasis on putting a major plain language effort through the organization. So we are watching out one another when it comes to trying to be using a language that works outside the house. We changed our way of thinking around these things and being open by turning around the following question: do we really have to communicate? Into another question: why should this not be communicated? And the overriding purpose, again, is to gain understanding, because if people understand what we do and try to achieve, the probability that they will trust us becomes much more increased and stay also on a high level. So, being transparent, and how do you then communicate in really, really difficult times? The autumn of 2008, financial unease in the United States kicks off a global financial crisis, and this had serious repercussions also in the Swedish financial system. We were looking into the deepest economic recession since the Second World War. The financial stability was threatened, the macro stability was threatened, and there was and dramatic measures became necessary. It was clear to the central bank. And as central bank, you are in the thick of the rescue operations, and all eyes were on us and the Ministry of Finance. And that actually had some profound effects on how the Riksbank looked at its own view of communications. Because when you are in a crisis, or if you're looking into a financial crisis abyss, it is really difficult to communicate unease without causing more concern, right? You don't want to add to the anxiety. So how then do you do that? Well, the Riksbank of the time tried to be open and clearly communicate what is the present situation, what do we want to achieve, what are possible tools to achieve that which is regaining the financial stability. You have to speak more about process. You don't want to pre-commit to measures, but you can always talk about where you are, what you want to achieve, and the process of how to get there. And being by widely accessible and through active and timely communication with the media and financial market participants, having a very active communication on our webpage and various speeches and interviews, and we try to be there, or the central bank all the time try to be there as much as possible. And it has characterized the Riksbank's communication during the financial crisis and afterwards. But in order to be successful around these things, people have to know what central banks actually do. So we asked them, this is a slide, if you focus on the red words, you can see there that in 2007, knowledge and attitudes were very diverse among different stakeholders. And what is striking to me here is that politicians, so we interview people I think it's every second year. We interview these stakeholders. What do you know about the Riksbank's job in different areas? And what do you think about what we achieve? And as you can see there, politicians, on average, had a pretty low knowledge about the role of central banks in financial crises. And you could also see that their attitudes, well, room for improvement is what I like to say. On the other hand, other authorities, the financial market and media, they are red in the other upper right corner. They had a pretty good knowledge about what we try to achieve, and they also had some good attitudes. So to adapt to and understand, we needed to teach them what is the role of the central bank, what is lender of last resort, what is a safe and efficient payment system. And here you have to do some serious footwork. So the active communication was aimed towards several different target groups. There was a variety of seminars, breakfasts, newsletters, hearings. There is no shortcuts here. You have to do the footwork. And as you can see, the result was a shift over time. And I am particularly happy to see that our legislators, the politicians, now have a very high level of knowledge, and their attitudes have also increased considerably. But that was then. Now the question is, where are we now? Well, the years of the financial crisis in the global world has characterized that some politicians want to take back control of the central bank and also monetary policy. In a way, I can understand this. After the global financial crisis, there has been turbulent times, disappointing growth. If you look at the economic distribution between the rich and the not so rich, there are disappointments there as well. And I think many politicians and other stakeholders now take low and stable inflation for granted. And so the idea of having independent central banks are, to some extent, being forgotten. I think the independence is also under attack since some just simply dislike and wish to undermine independent institutions altogether. I think we need to talk about this. I think can understand that there are dissatisfaction. I also think that the money central banks are fighting an uphill battle with the confidence figures. We sometimes get blamed for things we are not supposed or we cannot influence. We also sometimes get blamed for things other policy areas are much more capable than us to reform. And even in a country like Sweden, where the general level of confidence is quite high in the public institutions, we also receive a flurry of criticism. So, again, you have to get stuck in and do the footwork. You have to get involved in the debate, you have to be prepared to participate when you get the chance, and you have to give answers to difficult questions. So this is me, 4 nights ago, Sunday night, on national television, one of the more prestigious interview programs. about why we are not doing price stability targeting by pegging our krona to, for instance, the euro, but we're doing it through a floating exchange rate and pegging it in terms of an inflation target instead. And this is a big thing in Sweden right now because the currency has depreciated. So people get upset because their holidays, summer holidays, get more expensive. But also more seriously, import companies has not expected this and they get into trouble. So tough interviews and you have to step up and give some good answers. So you have to aim wide in communication. Not only reach the classic target groups for central banks, such as financial market participants and politicians, but also aim for new groups, the general public, not at least the young adults. So we're thinking now a lot about how to slice and dice our communication strategy in order to meet the different audiences that are outside. And we have to tell our story in ways that we think are appropriate from different groups. And there are a variety of knowledges out there, those who are of a deep understanding of what monetary policy about, but we also want to reach those who only knows us by name. And in order to do that, we have to be relevant and comprehensible. With every new generation, you have to think about how do you do the communication in the best possible way. This is not a time for sitting back and relax. We are determined in our communications efforts. There has been a high and stable confidence among the Swedish general public towards the Riksbank for the last 2 decades, but we need constantly to deserve that level of confidence. So with our communication, we try to influence people's day-to-day behaviors, how they consume, how they borrow, how they save, because by doing so, we hope to create conditions for good economic developments. If micro works, our macro job to stabilize it will be a lot easier. So, applicable and comprehensible messages make people aware, and in that way we hope to strengthen our trust among the general public, and we think that becomes a positive spiral that makes our life, all our lives, much better. This means that we must communicate in a way that many different people understand. Because, as I said, there are different levels of advanced knowledge regarding central banks' operations. So we need to create stories, a context, and this is especially important when you communicate in different parts of the general public. And there we have to be trying to make as many as possible to understand how the various parts of the economy function, how they are interconnected, and how the central bank fits into the economy. And I've been giving a number of public speeches over the years, and I have a very strong feeling that people really want to know, they want to learn, they want to be able to understand. And give them a chance, they won't let you go. And I've been overextending my time at lectures several times because the questions come rolling in and people really take the chance to learn and adapt to it. From a purely practical point of view, this means that although I'm having a written speech here to help the life of the interpreters there in the box, we usually try to be without these kind of speaking notes in order to be able to adjust our message. It's a tough job. We have in Sweden 10 million inhabitants, much smaller than Ukraine, but still. And the executive board do hundreds of presentations and meet thousands of people, and still, that's not enough. So we are looking for what we call the torchbearers that can also help us carry our story forward. One important group, or torchbearers, are, of course, journalists. And then we have to appreciate that there is so-called old media and new media. And we can never expect journalists to be our cheerleaders. But what we try to achieve is to create an understanding for why we are having the objective we have and why we think that our work, if we are successful, improves the economy long term and what the tools are that we use to achieve that objective. So we spend a lot of time meeting with journalists, key players on financial markets, but also politicians that we hope can pass the story on to their various stakeholders. And the new media climate, they provide opportunities, but also challenges. new technology, new communication channels, and the new media climate. And it has become also more general that the general public is increasingly more important to reach, because there's a lot of both real information and fake information out there. Journalists, I think, is a fantastic work group, because they has the ability, like no other, to explain the world to his or her audience. And again, we cannot expect them to be cheerleaders for the central bank, but trying to get them to understand what we can achieve and what we cannot achieve, and appreciate the role of the central banks, is something that we will be striving for doing. Now, journalists' driving force is usually commercial. They need to sell a newspaper or gain attraction in terms of listeners and viewers. And they'd like to get their news heard, preferably in new communication channels as well. We are looking into more of opinion journalism, and I have no problem with that. I think as long as the quotes are accurate, and we hope for not deliberate misunderstandings. But you can never expect angles to be particularly flattering, and the core role of the journalist is to scrutinize political and powerful institutions such as the central bank. So it's a bit of a tough love out there, and that has to be appreciated and respected. There's also new technology and new channels providing new challenges. It can reach many people wherever and whenever, and this creates new problems and challenges. What is the, how quick should you be in responding? Should you respond at all? What should be your personal tone? What should be your response? And the readers and listeners of Twitter, for example, they usually lack patience, they rush through, they scroll and they skim. And a brusque tone on Twitter usually pays off, and traditional media sometimes jump on that bandwagon. And the question is, how should a central bank be heard amidst all the noise? And should we at all be on the social digital channels? And we have discussed this at length at the central bank in Sweden. And we have come up with the conclusion, yes, being passive is not a sustainable strategy. So we are trying to understand the new channels. We maintain contact with target groups through both traditional and new channels, and then we evaluate what works. We are constantly evaluating the ways we do this. So since a couple of years back, we have 4 official accounts: Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And our initiatives is to increase our reach, and it has been fairly successful. It's creating more involvement and dialogue, and has been really great in terms of the interaction we have with people. Favorable results, I think. We passed 10,000 followers on both Twitter and LinkedIn recently, and we can see that the engagement in terms of number of clicks, likes, comments, shares is increasing every year. We have also decided that moving images is increasingly important. So we try to, this is an important difference from before. Moving material, films are increasingly in focus instead of having the central bank traditional thing of a long read. We do interviews that we record and publish in conjunction with interest rate decisions. Video clips reach much more people than interviews written as texts. And we also spend time doing video material, so-called explainers, explaining short bits of different parts of monetary policy or central bank operations as a whole. And then we make sure we have subtitles so people can take the message without actually having to listen to it, just reading it. Is this good communication? Yeah, we think it works very well. This not only means that we are creating new meeting places for discussions. We also get a lot of feedback which we can interpret. So we are increasing our digital presence. We increase opportunity, convey unfiltered messages. But we are also creating new places for discussions with various stakeholders. So not only bankers and politicians are stakeholders, but we are also out in the country giving talks and listen to the audience on a number of different subjects. We work a lot with an effective and modern website. We work a lot with messages, with tone and form to suit different target groups. And we try to find the right tone in social media channels. The job never stops, it just carries on. And we develop also strategy for infographics. Layered communication, a bit of a hype word, but it's about thinking about message and language. My personal favorite is Bank of England. They are very much in the forefront of doing things in this area. And we think about choose the appropriate level and complexity in your messages to convey and where to be detailed with the backgrounds, arguments, and consequences. Think about how to simplify reasoning and languages. And we're also watching out for one another when it comes to the Swedish Language Act. Official language must be simple, correct, and comprehensible. And we actually have one language supervisor checking the material that we produce. And she can be pretty rough on us board members as well, I can tell you. So she has a very strong position in the office. Another example, what we do is having a regular chat with the governor. This is Stefan Ingves having one of the chats that he has after each and every Riksbank policy announcement. It used to be on the Riksbank website, but the major media are now happy to host this. So Stefan takes the round doing different media chats at different media outlets after each meeting. It's a very effective direct contact with people. He shoots off 15 replies in 30 minutes. There's no chopping and changing here. It's a very much a real-time operation. And does it work? Yes, it does. As far as to my knowledge, there has never been any confusion or criticism about him being incorrect or simplifying messages. And just to give you a little bit of a story here, I've been told that the first time the governor was doing this, he had a number of experts behind him. And when the first question came in, you know what happens with experts? They start to argue with one another. And as they were arguing with one another, the governor punched down a couple of sentences to reply to this question and sent it off. And the expert said, "Oh, what are you doing?" Well, this is a chat, guys, you know. It's supposed to be real time. And since then, he's doing this on his own. So, to come to an end of this presentation, independent central banks has an important task in contributing with price stability in order to provide prosperous economies. And being independent, I think, is an important piece in this. And it's only borrowed from the legislators. We have to remember it can be reversed. I hope I have convinced you that by making public transparency a reality, I think we improve our chances to protect our remits and what therefore we can achieve for the general economy. I think transparency is even more important than ever before because it's a prerequisite needed to be able to hold us account for our policy. I used to think about policy, I used to think about transparency as having a really tough boss sitting looking at you. It's truly fostering. It brings out the best achievement in all of us. With agile, well-considered and comprehensible communication that is engaged and engaging, I think we can create, not only create, but also maintain a high level of confidence and the necessary legitimacy to be able to fulfill our missions. By staying relevant, the central bank can adapt to new demands and meet new groups on their terms. I hope for inspiring and constructive discussions today and tomorrow about how we can improve, but because it's only through improvements that we meet our challenges of today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecilia, for getting us through this insightful and fascinating journey of Riksbank communications over the last 20 years. Okay, I now immediately open the floor for questions. Please. The question was there. The mic is there, yeah.
Hi, you alluded to central bank communication as a dialogue, that you not only try to talk to the public, but in some cases to listen to the opinions of various stakeholders. And I was curious if you have any examples of how that listening has resulted in any kind of policy changes, or is it more just to kind of make them feel good, or does it actually have some real observable effects?
So that's an excellent question. No, you can. I would like to say that we do not change our policy because we listen to the audience. We have to follow our mandate, and the mandate is based on the forecast, which is, to the best of our ability, a very accurate forecast. But what people are saying is still being brought into our work because we do corporate interviews. So our policy department, some people are doing interviews, a bit like the Beige Book, I would say. And there you manage to pick more of the qualitative information, things that you perhaps not pick up in the data to the same extent. So there is influence, but not in the way that we are changing our policy because what people say, but rather what it means to our assessment of the economy, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Next question, please. Please over there.
Thank you for your great presentation and for all your work you're doing around the e-corona as well throughout the world, communicating about the digital revolution in Sweden, I would like to say. I'm Geert Sio, I'm the Communication Director of the Central Bank of Belgium. So I speak from a communication department's perspective, and I would like to bring some elements in the discussion, and I would like to have your opinion on it as well. When I speak with my colleagues in the ECB and older central bank communication directors, we experience that it becomes more and more challenging to convey our message. There are less journalists interested in our press conferences. These journalists receive less space for articles in their publications. We have the social media revolution on the other hand side. So it becomes more and more challenging for us. The question is not only what is the public seeing our message, but can we still address ourselves to the public? Because the media are not always listening to us anymore. They want more juicy stories. They, when you have a boring message about, yeah, the interest rate is not changing, well, why should we report about it then? That kind of discussion we are facing throughout Europe, and also when I speak with the colleagues of other parts of the world, we have the same problem. And I would like to encourage the academics here not only to make a study about how the public is perceiving everything, but also how we as communication directors are facing challenges conveying our message through the media. I would like to have your opinion on this, your views on this, and your experience in Sweden. Thank you.
So, yeah, I agree with everything you say, that the media landscape is changing in many different ways. And I have all colleagues in journalism who do very different things in their day jobs now. They're still within media one way or the other, but it's very different from where they wrote an article and that was it. So first I think we have to acknowledge that and think about what are the new ways to communicate. And I try to give you a feeling for how we think about Twitter and Facebook and live chats and things like that. So try to roll with the changes and see how you can get the message through. There is another take on also what you are saying, and that is a bit boring, no change in policy. Maybe not. That's not such a bad thing, come to think of it. That we are not always gaining the attention. I always used to think about when the whole of the world is looking at the central banks, it probably means that we are in a very bad place to be. So I wish we have a situation where central banking is pretty boring. People know what to expect. They can go on their lives doing other things than having to worry about what the interest rate will be. So try to bring in that bit of a mindset, and it's much more relaxing.
I wish it would be true, but I really doubt it would happen anytime soon.
I don't think we will ever get into a situation where central banking become boring again, but you can always hope for it.
Where do you draw the line? What should be kept out of the transparent transparency regime, and why? You know, what should be kept maybe secret or opaque or not communicated fully, and why?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. Where do you stop? I think you have to be very careful when you open things up. I know that every step of the way that I showed you, talked about having press conferences after each meeting, having minutes with individual names, who says what, has been carefully assessed. Because once you open it up, there is no turning back, and you can't turn back if there is a crisis, for example. That's really shooting yourself in the foot in terms of maintaining trust and legitimacy. I think there is a peak somewhere where it's no point in actually move further, or if you move further, people will just get confused. I know some academic who said, why not live broadcast the policy meetings? I think that's a perfect example of where you get too far. But I don't think we have reached the sort of the top end yet, but I think we're getting quite close. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, please.
Thank you, Vice Governor, for a very interesting speech. I have a question about criteria of choosing channels of communication, Riksbanks. Why your Instagram account, Riksbank official, has only 39 followers? Young people from Instagram is not your target auditorium. Maybe central bank will be more young-oriented and bright and sexy. Thank you. Why about Instagram of Riksbank?
Okay, something wrong with the microphone. I don't hear everything you said, but it was about Instagram and sexy. That I picked up. It says probably more about me than about you. But let's be serious. We are in the business of providing price stability, right? It's never going to have much followers on Instagram. So be there. One day that you might have a crisis, and then that account will probably pick up tremendously. And then you will have a channel sort of sleeping, and for another day it will be very useful.
Okay. Any questions on Facebook now?
I work for the Austrian Central Bank, but I'm Czech, and I remember when the Czech Central Bank introduced the exchange rate floor, then all of a sudden 10 million experts on monetary policy popped up in the country. I'm sure Mr. Singer, the former governor who's in the room, would have a long story to tell about this. So I'm wondering whether the enormous effort that you are making increases the sympathy and decreases the level of controversy of your steps. So would you say that it really pays off? Thank you.
So will it become less controversial if we have a higher level of communication? That's basically the question. I don't think, that's not our mindset, that if we are very communicative and very transparent, the debate will die down and everybody will just accept what we're doing and go on in their own lives. I think this is a possibility for people to get information on their terms, which I think is really crucial, because, you know, face it, nobody outside our community, you know, jumps all over a monetary policy report and have a field moment with that. So most people want to have a short explanation, and then you can always have links if people want to learn more. But I think we should never be afraid, or should never try to design our communication strategy with the objective to put a lid on the debate. What we are doing in central banks are affecting people's lives, and we have to appreciate that. And they will express views, and I think it's a lot better that they do it and we see it and can reflect on it, rather than trying to be very restricted and limited in our communications. And the comments takes place somewhere else. So I'd rather see the criticism rather than not. We also got praise, I can tell you. We also get praise.
Okay, please.
Hi, Filiz Ünsal from IMF. I just have a quick question. You know, when we are talking about communication, even the name of the conference is Central Bank Communications, but we are focusing on monetary policy mostly. After the crisis, many central banks adopted other functions, mostly macroprudential supervision, crisis resolution. In some of the countries that I've worked, sometimes central banks are a bit reluctant to communicate about other policies, thinking that this is going to hurt their communication regarding monetary policy. So I was wondering what's your views about whether there are synergies in communicating other policies or there are trade-offs? Thank you.
So that's very good question, because the remits have been extended in a number of central banks, not my own, but Bank of England is a typical example of this. I think you have to communicate what you're doing in other policy areas if you have an extended remit to do so. It depends a little bit of what you do. I can appreciate that capital requirements, liquidity requirements, really technical stuff. It probably is only interesting for a very minor group in society. It's bankers and the likes. But I think it's good to open up the channels also to different stakeholders, also when it comes to macroprudential policy, for the following reason. One day the central bank will do something that affects people's wallets. It's compulsory amortization or whatever that is actually affecting people. If the central bank has already started to communicate around these things, it's much more prepared to take that decision and communicate that decision, compared to if you had been completely silent on macro-pro and then all of a sudden burst the door open and say, this is what we do in the interest of financial stability. I think that could be create some bad results and bad feelings across the stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for one more question.
Hello.
Please,
how did you manage to increase the awareness of the politicians through these years? Because it was really impressive. And these attacks on the independence of the central bank are not a side effect of knowing better the power of this institution?
Could you repeat the second question, please?
The attacks on the central banks could not be a side effect of knowing better what this institution is doing.
So the first question, how do we actually increase the knowledge? Well, first of all, I think, you know what they say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And I think the central bank took the opportunity, since the crisis was on everybody's lips, right? People wanted to understand how can something in the United States, some prime area, affect us in this bad way. So I think there was a constant demand for 2-3 years among politicians to actually understand how the financial system is interlinked and interconnected, and what central banks can do and not do in order to stabilize the situation. So I think there was a great interest at the time. If you ask the politicians now, they are less interested because they think that they know quite a lot. So they prioritize other more crucial areas. And then your second question, which is a very good one. Does the more knowledge means more criticism? But I don't think ignorance is a better place to be in. I think ignorance creates lack of power among people. If people understand how economic policy framework is designed in a country, we have a floating exchange rate and not a pegged exchange rate. This means certain things when you go abroad, but it means on the average pegged or stabilized inflation. You know, you can if you understand how the system works, you seem to trust it more. It's like flying, right? We all step into a plane and we're going from A to B without really knowing, or at least not myself, knowing exactly how the aviation works. But we step into the plane anyway because we see others doing it and because we think, the authorities probably controls this. And when there is, unfortunately, a crash, there is always a great investigation into this. So we continue to step into planes and fly to A to B. And I think if we knew a bit more, we become less uncomfortable when there's a turbulence, because the turbulence is not supposed to be dangerous in any way. So with knowledge comes power, and I think power is the way for people to choose their paths in life based on knowledge, rather than being in the hands of people with agendas that we don't, with agendas that is potentially harmful long term for the society.
Okay, thank you, dear colleagues. Please join me in thanking our prominent keynote speaker today. And now we have the most important part of our conference, which is lunch. Thank you, and we reconvene in 1:30.